Well, hey there, this is Cindy, and thanks so much for joining us today as always. And I'm so glad you're here, and I cannot wait for you to hear today's episode. But just before we dive in, I wanted to share some ways that we can work together if you're looking to up-level your negotiation skills. I have everything from online to group to signature one-on-one mastermind or VIP experiences available to help you leverage your innate power to get more of what you want and deserve in life. So if that sounds interesting, check that out at artoffemininenegotiation.com. But now to the reason why you're here today, let me introduce you to Rachael Boone, or Ray as I know her. We're going to be talking about negotiating in today's new reality. So welcome, Ray. It is so great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here today.
Yeah, I can't wait. Ray and I had the pleasure of meeting on Clubhouse, and every time she jumps into the room, she's always dropping incredible golden gems. So I can't wait to hear what we've got in store today. You might want to grab a pad and pen to take some notes, or at the very least, remember the link so you can rewatch the podcast or listen as may serve you. So for those who don't happen to know Rachael, she's the CEO and founder of BeEvolvedHR. It's a human resources and leadership coaching consultancy, and she's based out of Raleigh, North Carolina. So tell us, Ray, how did you come to do this work?
It goes back 20 years. I actually got started in this work. I actually started in recruitment. Let me just fast forward. It actually started, the seed was planted at IBM back in 2000. I got involved with a career coach when back in 2000 at IBM, I ran into some HR professionals and I was inspired by the field and I started learning. And I entered the field as a recruiter. And from there, I grew my skills and I became an HR business partner leader in an organization, leading a $200 million organization from an HR perspective.
Wow. Pretty impressive. Now, I know your vision, which I just love, was sort of created out of a desire to inspire and empower and educate. You do such a great job of that, working with entrepreneurs, leaders, aspiring leaders. So tell me, what are some of your hot tips to do that? How do you inspire and empower those leaders and future leaders?
You know what? I've had the opportunity. So from this angle, I work with leaders. So I have an opportunity to go into the organization, impact leaders from the top down, right? So this work to me is full of the human impact and human relations, human engagement, and having the ability to just inspire my leaders. This work allows me to impact every person in the organization. For example, from my leadership abilities and inspiring the leaders, it allows me to, I would say I'm an extension to the company, and I'm literally physically a business partner. I do so much more than HR, because when you become a business partner, you're engaged with every function of the business. And my company functions as an extension and to my customers. And in return, I'm afforded the opportunity to sit with each business leader based on that function in the business.
Yeah. Well, what a great opportunity to have meaningful impact, right? I mean, when you've got access to sort of the top level within an organization, you can actually really affect meaningful change.
Absolutely.
And especially today, we're seeing such changing perspectives on leadership and negotiation success, moving from that sort of competitive to more cooperative model. Finally, hallelujah. Yes. And I'd love your thoughts or experiences around that, Ray.
Well, you know, the world has changed. I will go back from I would say the last 24 to 36 months. The world has changed. And COVID expedited the collaborative process, right? So many things has happened in the last 36 months, from COVID to George Floyd. It has impacted the way we see our employees and also how we treat our employees. And so impacting change, it starts negotiation. We've now went from negotiating how our employees work, but also from a physical and mental perspective, negotiating how we see our employees in the field. But more importantly, that negotiation is from the start of their work and to the life cycle. And when I say start, we start with negotiation from the time they enter into the space until all the way up until employee engagement. This is how we view negotiation. And what do I mean by that? When I say from the start, recruitment hit from my employees coming into the workplace, and from a negotiation on how we see and view our employees, from how they work, when they work, checking from the start, from the beginning until the end of their workday. We negotiate.
That's beautiful. And tell me, how has that changed, or how does it sounds like you're already changing? No surprise. I mean, you're always so progressive and ahead of the curve on this stuff. So what advice do you have? Like, how does HR need to change in today's changing climate, do you think, Ray?
Yeah, you know, that's interesting, because I think most HR professionals now are truly getting back to the basics. It's putting human
Nice.
back into human resources.
I love that.
And that is something I think we are really collectively, whether you work from, now I work with different types of industries, but I also work with different sizes of organizations, right? And when I think about the landscape, some companies are more progressive than others. And being in the middle, being on the ground level for my corporate clients versus my startup clients, right?
Yeah.
Their needs are so different.
Yeah.
And so that negotiation is so different from a startup, like I said, from a startup versus a growth company. It all goes back to the needs, right, of the business. We know that. But in terms of the climate and how HR is changing, number one, like I said, we're putting human back into human resources, but also we're looking at our employee base and we're really trying to find happy mediums for them. Because now, with COVID, we've expedited working remotely. And being hybrid and having to understand from our employees' perspective, because we now live in a gig society. The workplace has changed from how we onboard, but also how we look at talent within the organization. And we think about from the whole landscape of things, the negotiation from HR perspective is finding a way. We have now changed the way we make offers. We've changed the way how, the hours expectations. We've changed, and not all companies, but a lot of progressive companies have. We had to adjust because we were losing talent. And women specifically were leaving the workplace at a faster rate than men because they had a lot of pressures on trying to balance childcare, balance careers, and things of that nature. So we had to take a step back and look at how we were treating our employees and what we were offering our employees in terms of working for our organizations.
Well, I love that. And you've really hit on something, because I'm hearing a lot of conflict out there now about people talking, well, we've got the great resignation, so the power is with the employees. And some people are like, no, we've got the great reset now because with the recession coming, the power is with employers. So I'd love your thoughts on that, like in terms of who holds the power, or is that even a relevant question anymore?
I think it's a balance. I think it's industry specific because we're seeing some layoffs, right? I'm seeing trendings with the financial fintech industry. We're seeing impacts in the real estate industry. And that has caused a tipping point, so to speak, scaling back on the IT side of things. And so I think we're in that balance. It just depends on the industry. Some industries are still seeing the trends of the great resignation, but I think it's balancing off because I'm seeing more and more layoffs happening and readjustments happening, offers being rescinded.
Wow.
I think you have to be very careful now when you're talking about a new offer and making sure you have all your ducks in a row and making sure it's truly in that forecast and plan. You can never predict a layoff because you never know. Those folks who were in the middle before it changed a couple of months ago and the reset, they're experiencing layoffs within the first 4 months of their employment. I'm seeing a lot of open to work on LinkedIn, more than I have within the last 6 months.
Okay, good to know. Really good to know. Great advice. Now, I know you bring a lot of experience from holding leadership positions with Fortune 500 tech companies. So I'd love if you don't mind sharing your experience as a woman and what, at least historically, and still, I mean, we're changing, but a very male dominated kind of industry. How did you negotiate or navigate through that? And what did you learn from those experiences?
Well, Cindy, I think we're constantly evolving. I think it's, we're constantly evolving as women. And then understanding your worth, knowing your worth is so important.
Yeah.
And navigating those fields and trying to find your space and your voice in a male dominant industry is really about having a tribe, support, allies, right?
Yeah.
I really do think it's important to build communities, but let me just kind of back a little bit. Being a woman, obviously I'm a woman and a woman of color, navigating a technical space wasn't always easy for me. The landscape, I never use it as an excuse, but as an opportunity. So I never allowed that to sink and say what I couldn't have. I was always forward thinking about, I deserve to be here. I put tools in my toolbox to make myself available to do the work. And I focused on the facts and what I could do and building relationships, right? But what I will say is there were challenging and still challenging times in the tech space. I just left a big client in fintech space in a technical where it's in Boise, Idaho. Think about that. Even though I'm remote, but it's Boise, Idaho, right?
Yeah.
And being in a leadership role there, it was challenging. And I say challenging because I trusted them initially, but
Yeah.
they had to find trust in me before they allowed me into their space and navigating it within the industry. And so how do you navigate and being the only one? I think it's really knowing who you are, knowing your worth, and knowing your value proposition, and coming in with success negotiation off the gate. And what do I mean by success negotiation? When you're in an environment where you're the only one, I think it's so important to stick to your SMART goals while you're there, keeping time, staying on top of your development, staying consistent with your plan of action on why you were hired, but also your non-negotiables, what you're willing to accept and not accept. But when I say build a tribe, you got to build a community that will allow you to be safe. And that's not always easy because again, you're coming in, I came in with the intentions of being accepted, appreciated, valued for my knowledge. And the other piece of that is I had to build those relationships to help make myself feel comfortable. And I also had a community outside of work to help me when I didn't feel comfortable.
Yeah. Beautiful. Oh my gosh, so much packed in there. My gosh, that was gorgeous answer. And one thing you talked about is that trust, that you were very intentional about looking to build that trust, to have them trust you. What are some of the ways that you did that? I think you probably spoke to a few there, but just to unpack it for our listeners, what are some tips you have on how they can build that trust relationship in an environment?
You know, it's about delivery. For me, it's first focusing on the facts. Is what coming in with the success negotiation and say, okay, what are the expectations for my role? Delivering on what I am expected to deliver on and timely, right? And if I run into roadblocks, communicate ahead of time. It goes back to the basic principles, right? Everybody wants to play fair in that sandbox. Right? Think about being little 5-year-olds out in the playground and wanted to be invited to play in the sandbox, right? For me, I always go back to the simplest form when you're talking about relationship building. And I recalled one of my colleagues, which is a male colleague, said to me, Rachel, how did you get involved with the Good Old Boy Network? And I think he literally said that to me. And one of the things that helped me navigate was I'm always kind. I always present myself as coachable. And also I give trust, but trust is incremental. For me, again, going back for the listeners, is delivering on time, keeping my word, and also reminding them that I walk the talk. And don't just say it, but let your actions line up with your deliverables. And that was how I was able to gain some trust.
And I assume some of that, as you were speaking, I'm wondering how big a role, because often women, we do the work, but we do it under the radar, assuming people will just know magically what we're doing. How important do you think it is, Rachel, to tout your horn a bit, at the very least, let people know what you're accomplishing when you're doing your work? How important would you say that is?
It's very important. You know, as I coach my clients today, I always tell them when they do, even if the manager does not ask for one-on-ones, I always say request one-on-ones, right? And keeping your log of what you do. I believe in when you have those one-on-ones, you establish that agenda and you remind them, because we forget along the way. And I had this coworker years ago who said me, she said, Rachel, I keep a log and a Word document of all of my accomplishments.
I love it.
And that was very transformational for me. And I even went back further to early in my career. My girlfriend was a sales professional and she always had that brag book. I literally went back the other day and I was digging through some files 20 something years ago. She told me about this and I literally forgot about it until I was on a Clubhouse call and said that brag book, proof of performance. It reminded me what we have in our toolbox and letting people know, especially our direct managers, know what we've done and what we're capable of. But also it goes back to that cross-functional, building those relationships is key. And getting involved in ERG groups, if it's a smaller company, it's hard because employee resource groups aren't necessarily created at a smaller level. But even having some people in your corner, whether it's a decision maker or non-decision maker, who can vouch for what you can do.
So good. And as you were talking, I was thinking about the brag book. As you know,
I was like, it's crazy. I literally went back because I keep everything. And I was going back, I put together a brag book because my good friend was a pharmaceutical sales rep. And sales performance is what they live and breathe. And so she said, Rachel, put this together. And that was a piece of coaching information she gave me 20 something years ago.
She was ahead of the curve, definitely ahead of me. I use the brag book all the time. I thought I had created the idea, clearly not. She was a good decade ahead of me. So that is awesome. And now you had mentioned about women evolving, and that really piqued my interest because I know you started a movement called She Evolved, which I love. So tell us a bit about your She Evolved movement.
You know, I literally took everything I pretty much experienced in the workplace, not everything, but a lot of my experiences and my experiences of friends. And I wrapped it into a full day conference, literally 8 to 5. The conference talks about, in Women on the Move, it's about how you evolve in your career, whether you're the only woman in a male dominant industry, knowing your worth, taking a leap of faith, meaning before you exit, looking at everything your current company has to offer before you take that leap of faith, right? Don't leave anything on a table. We talked about how you show up professionally based on your industry, but also we build a community where if you had anything that's going on in your workspace, we actually created a community so women would have a safe place to express themselves, because I think we hold so much in, hence the reason you talk about climate change, HR, mental health, physical health. All of this is like an ecosystem of bringing your whole self, but also mentally and physically bringing your whole self to work. And that's what that is and was. It's a day when a woman can bring her whole self to a conference. We talked about mental health in the conference. We talked about from everything from mental health down to having HR support.
Yeah, I so love the work that you do, Ray. And speaking of that, I know I'd read somewhere about your pink slip parties, which really caught my attention. Tell me about those. It's just too juicy to ignore.
Well, it's so crazy when this is how I started this work. I started this work literally giving back to the community. I got laid off from my job and I was like, what can I do to give back, to start a movement? Because remember, in 2008, we faced the worst economic downturn for white collar professionals. It was one of those things where we couldn't find jobs, financial, HR. We were like really stuck. So what I did was I reached out to a young lady in New York because they did it in New York. And I said, okay, how do we do something like this in North Carolina? I had a good friend who owned a restaurant at the time, and I wanted it in a relaxed environment where people could be themselves, because white collar professional was so stressed out during this time. The market was so tight, and the housing market crashed. We had a lot of turmoil happening. So this started out as a movement and then turned to a business. It was literally giving back, helping individuals who lost their job with job skills, job readiness, but also prepping their resume, partnering with company who was actually hiring during that time. And so we were able to place folks, and Walmart was one of my early adopters and they supported me, and I'm forever grateful for that movement.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. I love it. And I love the name Pink Slip Parties. I mean, it's just so perfect. I mean, instead it's a celebration, right? A recognition instead of, because as women in particular, we tend to really carry those so-called perceived failures. So I think that's just such a beautiful perspective shift. Now, you alluded to diversity earlier, and I know you do a lot of work around diversity, equity, and inclusion talent. So I'd love your perspective on what impact diversity has on negotiations in the workplace in your experience.
Well, for me, I've seen where, when study shows that you have more diverse teams, it impacts your bottom line, right? For me, it's about education. It's about like educating my leaders and explaining to them how this impacts having a more diverse staff, having a diverse team, and not just from Black and white, but all inclusion and diversity from all walks of life. I received a call last week from a company, 11,000 employees, right? And they have a 40-team HR team. And I asked this question. I said, do you have any diverse talent on your team and your HR team? There's 40 employees. Absolutely no one is diverse. No one. And it so happened to be an old colleague of mine. And she and I got to talking about the expectations in the company. And we touched on this because we really had transparent conversation. He doesn't walk like me, talk like me, etc. We always had a love for inclusion, because when I came on the team, we whined a little bit. I was the only one. And when I came there, I didn't want to be treated differently. I just wanted to do my work, but she embraced me and I embraced her. And that's our commonality. And we talked about how diversity impacts the numbers. And we know that. But she said, Rachel, when they get here, if we hire diverse talent, my concern now is how do we keep the talent, right? And so I think we have to think about, and I think about this work, is creating inclusive environments, because it's one thing to recruit, there's another thing to retain. And
Yes.
we have to be mindful of our culture. When we talk about diversity, we think about equity and we think about belonging, right? It goes back to the sandbox. We
Yeah.
all want to feel appreciated, valued, respected, and even loved. And we want to belong to organizations. And I think if CEOs capture that and not just do a check in the box, but really embrace that from top down, we solve the problem.
Such great advice. And especially in this world where there's so much increased awareness around it, I think we got a lot of organizations paying lip service to the concept,
Correct.
but not creating an actual
Correct.
culture shift that we
And it's
need.
got to be a culture shift.
Yeah.
And it's a culture shift where it's inclusive for all, not
Yeah.
for just one.
Yeah.
All.
Beautiful. And now what advice or tips do you have for our listeners on there if they're in a situation where it's that being box checked and then they're dealing with either overt discrimination or maybe even more subtle forms of discrimination in the workplace, in their negotiations? What advice or tips do you have on how to handle that?
Well, I think, Cindy, it goes back to is first, you got to be psychologically safe, right? That is important. And know your risk factors because not all organizations are open.
Yeah.
And we have to be realistic about this.
Yeah.
Not all environments are safe.
Yeah.
And I think you have to know the landscape of your organization. But also it goes back to, for me, it goes back, if I'm in an environment where I'm safe, I can have a conversation around when this happened to me, it made me feel like X and talking to that person, right? But also getting HR involved. I always say now this is a non-HR, this is a coach side of me.
Yeah.
I'm speaking from the coach side, right? It's really having hard conversations only if you're safe. If you're not safe, it's getting some support outside of work, but leveraging also, because I will tell you, especially non-dominant group, and that's anything outside of being white, it's having that safe haven and having a community where you can have those hard conversations.
Yeah.
I would say document things, especially if you're uncomfortable, having a conversation with the person who's actually having those or making you feel that way. And sometimes people I wouldn't say they're not aware. Some people aren't conscious of inclusion.
Yeah.
And they're doing more excluding versus including.
Yeah.
And if you have facts and you have examples, first having that conversation, but you have to be careful how you navigate and chart those waters. You have to be careful. And again, I think it goes back for the listeners. If you're safe, you can have that conversation. If not, that's another story. I mean, really, you have to ask yourself, what are your risk factors?
Yeah.
Because again, I think it goes into my theory around like bullying in the workplace. I think this comes along with the bullying in the workplace is actually and it happens more so in early in your career versus later in your career.
Yeah.
And it's really about having a safe haven, but also it's about not allowing your frustrations and your anger to show. You got to manage your emotions if that's happening to you. And being able to navigate that differently, if that makes sense.
Oh my gosh, yes. And it's funny, I was going to ask you about your views on how you negotiate with bullies in the workplace. So would that be the same advice that, about assess the safety levels, assess your risk value?
Yes. And you know what? And also, I think it goes back, I can't think of the term, but The Art of War, there's a book called The Art of War. And it's feeling safe. Safety allows you to share. And when you're not safe, we don't always share because of the risk factor. But I do want to just make sure I don't lose my point. I want to make sure, that when we talk about bullies in the workplace, it's having hard conversations, but also managing your emotions and also being comfortable having a hard conversation and building a team of support. Cindy, when you have a team of support, you can have allies, you can have leaders to approach, and HR is there to help as well. I would say don't suffer in silence because it goes back to your organization size. It goes back if HR is a supporter. But HR is changing the landscape. A lot of things have changed in the last 2 years, right? And what do I mean by that is HR will have an opportunity to put the human back in human resources.
Yeah.
Right? Meaning understanding from every employee's angle and doing something about it and having those hard conversations with those leaders as well.
Yeah. Such great advice packed in there. I love that. And I'm going to sort of shift gears a bit because I know you've done some really great work with UN Women as well and a lot of global work. So what advice do you have about or just information if you want to tell us about negotiating for change on the global scene? What have you done around that?
Well, so I got involved with UN Women about 4 or 5 years ago, and it really amplified the work that I do on a larger scale. And we had an initiative about inclusion and really driving from a pay transparency transparency perspective. And so in educating companies and opportunities, not just companies, but everyday people around education opportunities, around pay, around how we live, how we work. I mean, it was a whole gamut of work included in that work that we did. But specifically on the local level, we really, really got busy around the work we did after George Floyd and having resources available for everyday people, so to speak. You know, it's one thing to do this work when resources are available. There's another thing to get into the community with the people who are impacted, right? By what happened with George Floyd. And it's about getting in the communities. And sometimes those communities aren't communities that we're accustomed to going into. And we were able to go into those communities and do the work and having seminars and having resources available. And really understanding everyone's perspective, not just one class of people, but it was everybody. Because everybody was impacted by that situation.
Well, and it's funny you say that, because that there was such a seismic shift in perception. Even groups that previously had, you know, so whether willfully or not, kept the blinders on. You know, you talked earlier about that conscious versus unconscious levels, and it's like it burst through everybody's consciousness in a really,
because it was replaying in our head. We saw it on TVs, and people had a chance to sit home and see it. And it was in the middle of COVID, and you saw the movement. People were willing to risk their own safety and health on the front line through marching and through change behavior. And, you know, I remember being on a call, and this is why we have to keep the work active, because it can't just be lip service. It's got to be a continual movement. And the movement is doing the work, creating inclusive cultures, negotiating, HR comfortable negotiating and having tough conversations with their leaders. And it can't just be lip service. And because what happens is you notice on LinkedIn, you notice there's been a decline in the work around before, you know, I would say at the beginning of the height of post George Floyd, you saw so many roles for DEI work. And now you're seeing those roles trimming, but also cutting budgets. So the work has to stay alive because you repeat the same vicious cycle.
In so many areas.
And we can't afford that anymore.
We do. We see this in practicing social justice, labor, you know, law for 30 years. You see the same cycles repeat themselves, and you see the trend coming, and it's like you feel powerless sitting back watching it. So, but I love coming back to, because you've tapped a couple of times on that idea about human. And I think the situation with George Floyd, it resonated so deeply because it was so human and so visceral. Seeing a grown man crying for his mom, there was just something so profoundly human about that broke down all those barriers, and I think created a connection in a way it hadn't before. So, and obviously
it was disheartening to watch. And you know what? It's so funny. I'm a part of a book that I was a part of. It prompted a movement. It's called A Collective Breath, and it's stories from about 30 African-American men and women in corporate America around their views on what happened post George Floyd. And it's an anthology of about 30 authors. And I was fortunate to be a part of that. It's called A Collective Breath, but it's actually hearing the stories of being Black in corporate America.
I will have to check that out, and we'll make sure to put that in the show notes as well. So thank you for sharing.
And I wasn't even giving a plug. It was just really about, it made me think of that, because I never promote it.
It sounds like a beautiful resource. So thank you for
absolutely
sharing. Absolutely. And obviously there was a lot of emotion on that, which leads me into think, you know, I mean, as somebody who teaches negotiation as well, what role do you see emotion playing in negotiations?
Oh my goodness. You know, I think when you think about leaving the workforce and creating win-win, I think for me, I noticed negotiation, I can't compromise my mental health any longer. And from and women specifically, how they left the workplace, and I mean, the numbers were so, and they're forecasting even more, right? And so think about women said, you know what, enough is enough. And especially women of color. This was like the tipping point for a birth of entrepreneurship, gig working, stay-at-home mom. I think that, you know, they're not willing to compromise. If they are not in a culture where they don't feel like they belong, accepted, and appreciated, valued, they're not going to tolerate. There's no money worth it. That's why you see a lot of African-American workers, especially women of color, I would say that, have now said this remote work, they will never negotiate going back into the office. is.
Yeah, so true. And it's interesting because emotion, you used to, like many of the so-called feminine traits or soft skills, we used to see them as a liability and they were like something we had to stifle. And now we're starting to see people really recognize the value of EQ and
Absolutely.
those traits coming to the table. So beautiful to
Absolutely.
see. And what role do you see preparation playing in effective negotiation, especially in your world?
Well, preparation. Before we had this interview, a young lady, I was on the call, direct hire for one of my clients. And the young lady I advised, because I switched roles from coach to HR, there was no prep in the salary, right? It was literally no research. And I know we hear this. I'm in the work. I'm doing this work every single day. I'm in the trenches. And she has 17 years of experience. And she said to me, I don't want to say a number because I don't want to, if it's too high, they won't pick me. And I literally had to say to her, what is your worth? And this is where I said, I work for you, right? I work for you. I help negotiate a win-win for you as well. And I said, understanding that preparation is understanding your years of service, understanding this is from a recruiting perspective, looking at getting your foot in the door to a new organization, understanding your non-negotiables in terms of what is your number? What is it that you will not go below? You have to have a number, Cindy. If you're talking about planning and I'm looking at the front end on the recruitment side, you got to do your homework. And I'm telling you, these classes are so needed because we still are missing the mark. And this is a high level, highly compensated role, but the individual did not come prepared. And this is where I get pushback. Thankfully, I'm a good recruiter / coach because I said, hey, you have to know your worth, but you also know the value. You have 17 plus years of experience. And I said, what we can do is present you, have a number in your head that you want. Don't go below that number. And what do I mean by that? That's just one piece of it. Look at the benefits, look at tuition reimbursement, look at the vacation, look at the negotiation for whatever personal is it to you. So for me, and this the first step is planning. You got to do your research.
Yeah. So good. So good. And you've hit on so much there. I mean, value, which you've mentioned a few times, and you can't mention it enough. So I'm going to put another pin in that for our listeners. Own your value. It was across the board for everybody, but particularly I would send this message up there to our women who are listening, because we are so deeply conditioned to undervalue ourselves. And I want to amplify as well with Ray saying about asking. I mean, women don't ask as often. And also don't be afraid to set those aspirations levels high. Just such a beautiful answer. I love it.
I agree 100% because you know what, Cindy, we think we're being like this topic, but this is so true. We got to hear it so many times. Know your worth. Know your worth, know your worth.
Yeah. So great. And what do you think are the key skills or hallmarks in your experience that make for a really effective negotiator?
When you talk about your skills and knowing, I think for me, and what I'll tell my folks as we coach, calm down, read what's in front of you.
Nice.
Don't talk too much. Listen, because how many words do we digest a day? And we say a day. Review what's being presented to you, right? Because it's so important to listen in negotiation. We talk sometimes a little too much in timing, right? And then I'll ask myself, what do I need to make this wise decision? What do I need to make this movement? Right? If I make this, how does this impact my overall life? No matter what it is, from buying a car, getting a job, everything. I feel like those are some top 3 skills you can use and leverage.
Oh, Ray, I don't know, we've done 100 and something of these episodes and I haven't had that answer before. And I think it is gorgeous, right? And I just want to replay that for our listeners, like calm, right? Like just take that breath, find a centered place. I don't know that anybody's mentioned that as one of the key skills to being a great negotiator. And it's such a profound one, right? So simple, but so often overlooked in the moment when we have those triggers. So just calm, allow yourself to be calm and be grounded and listen versus talk. Oh my gosh. In North America in particular, we're so conditioned to believe that the person talking the loudest and longest is winning the negotiation, whatever that means. And in fact, the opposite is true. Come from a place of curiosity and listen, listen. And I love that subtlety of the last point you raised, Ray. And I just want to really amplify that for our listeners. This idea about like, know what outcome you want and also extend that by considering the impact of that. So often I see negotiations where people ask for things without thinking that the long-term implications of that don't actually serve you, right? Like be careful what you ask for. So consider the outcome and then go that step further about the impact of that outcome on you. Such a beautiful answer. And Ray, this has been gorgeous. I cannot believe how quick our time goes. I could be
Yeah.
talking to you all day here, and we'll have to get you back for sure
Yes.
and do a follow-up because this has been just so beautiful. And I normally like to end by asking, what's one of the greatest mindset shifts that you've had in your life? And again, it doesn't have to be around your work. It can be just even a subtle shift that's like one of those aha moments that changes how you think about how you show up in the world.
I think it goes back to my company. Just be evolved, be yourself, continually evolve, and just be yourself and know your worth. And that's what it is.
Oh, Be Evolved. I love that name, by the way. If I didn't mention
Thank
it, I
you.
got Be Evolved, She Evolved. I mean, they're just it's so clever and so powerful. So
Thank
tell
you.
our listeners out there, Rachael, where can they learn some more about you?
Well, you can learn more about me. You can find me on Instagram at BeEvolvedHR, and my website is BeEvolvedHR.com. You just shoot me a message. I answer emails daily, so you can reach me there.
Okay, beautiful. And we'll make sure to put those in the show notes for our listeners there.
Thank
So
you.
make sure to check that out and reach out, obviously, to Ray if you've got any questions, either for your corporation, if you're looking, or if you're looking for some individual coaching on that. And Ray, again, I can't thank you enough. It's just been a fabulous conversation.
Thank you.
So many beautiful layers to unpack here. So thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
And I am sure for our listeners out there that you guys just got a ton of value here today. Make sure you go back, re-listen to the episode to let it sort of riffle over you again and really absorb it. And be sure to share it. Give the gift of sharing with someone that you think could get some value from this. Share the podcast and share this episode. And feel free to give us a rating as well. We're always happy to take a review or a rating on the podcast here. And also make sure to check out my new book, Art of Feminine Negotiation, either on Amazon or you can check it out at artoffemininenegotiationbook.com. And that is a wrap for this episode. So until next time, go forth and negotiate your best life on your terms so you can stop missing out and start getting more of what you want and deserve from the boardroom to the bedroom. Until next time, take care.